So this video is going to be looking at some of the problems in the late Republic in the 70s BC. So there are some varying sections of Plutarch, a small extract from Sallust, and then a section of one of Cicero's speeches. So the first issue that sources raise is to do with the impact of Sulla and the rise of Pompey. So Pompey had fought for Sulla during the civil war between Sulla and Marius. We haven't mentioned Pompey at all at this particular point. It's one of the most famous Romans. Most people know Pompey the Great. So as a result of him fighting, I will point out, actually before I talk about that he was far too young to be fighting. So he had essentially inherited an army from his father, not inherited in the classical sense, but the army was sort of, how can I explain this properly without rambling, was loyal to his father, and he then inherited it after his father died. Now, Pompey was about 20 when this happened, so he was far too young to have an army. He has had no position on the cursus honorum, so everything he is doing during the civil wars is kind of illegal. And these are the kind of actions that Sulla, through his reforms, have been trying to stop. So there's going to be a little bit of irony in terms of Sulla undoing his own reforms. So as a result of his actions during the civil war, Pompey then asks for a triumph. Okay, so the request was posed by Sulla, who pointed out legally this was an honour that can only be given to a consul or a praetor, but to no one else, because Pompey hasn't had either of those positions. So if he does get given the triumph, it is illegal, and hence why Sulla is not supporting it. And he also points out that Pompey was too young even to be a senator, let alone anything else. And if he did ride and get the triumph, people would be angry not only with Sulla's government, but also Pompey himself for receiving such an honour. Probably true. So Sulla says his request could not be allowed, and he would oppose him to put a stop to his ambitious plans. So we do have some evidence here of Pompey beginning to kind of flex his muscles a little bit and show that he's after some sort of power. And this is going to be kind of like a thing that goes on with Pompey throughout his whole career. However, Pompey's not worried, so he asks Sulla to bear in mind that the fact that more people worship the rising than the setting sun, implying that his own power was on the increase, which is true, and Sulla was growing less and less. I mean, Sulla at this point is still dictator, but I think Pompey's point is wider. Sulla was getting old, and people were looking towards new figures to sort of follow, and Pompey's one of these new figures, and he was becoming very famous, and Sulla is a very unpleasant dictator. Also, we looked at his actions while dictator and the prescriptions, and this is, he's not loved. So I think Pompey's point is probably very true. So Sulla doesn't really understand it initially because he's a bit old, and everyone's a bit kind of shocked at what Pompey said. And then when he's retold what Pompey has said, he's astounded at Pompey's audacity and cried out twice in succession, let him have his triumph. So whether he does that because he supports Pompey, no. He does this because he's kind of a bit shocked and says, like, just let him have the triumph, whatever. So he's given the triumph, which I said is illegal. And there is an issue with Pompey's soldiers. They hadn't been given some reward. So when generals had control of their army, it was the general's responsibility to give them pensions at the end of the campaign. So this could be rewards, money, whatever it's going to be. It doesn't fall to the state, it falls to the general, which, as you can imagine, causes all sorts of problems in the late Republic, because you have generals who have an army who's responsible, and they're really loyal to the general, not to the state. So Pompey's army starts to show some kind of mutinous behaviours, and Pompey sort of says, I'll give up the triumph if it means I can keep my to make sure my troops are happy. And it's at that point that most people sort of say, Pompey deserves this triumph now because he's willing to give it up in order to keep his troops happy and acting like a good republican, basically. It's also clear at this time Pompey could easily become a member of the Senate if he'd wished to do so. So his reputation's riding high, he's got great glory, everybody really likes him. And through his behaviour during the Civil War and sort of that comes afterwards, had a considerable effect in making him popular among the ordinary people. So it does show that military glory and military prowess is what gets you a ticket into the Senate, not necessarily because you have actually followed the cursus honorum legally. This is a problem that's going to reoccur quite a few times. So we have a bit of jealousy between the two. So Sulla was far from pleased when he saw how Pompey's reputation and power were growing. Yeah, but he wasn't. But he was ashamed to interfere and did nothing about it. And it's not long after this that Sulla retires from Rome. Obviously not at this particular point, but he's beginning to edge towards retirement. So he does show some annoyance when Pompey helps get this guy called Lepidus elected, and he helped him with canvassing, using his own personal popularity to win the support of the people. So obviously in a few lessons ago, we talked about how you could kind of borrow someone else's dignitas to get elected. This is a really good example of this. And Lepidus is staunchly anti-Sulla. So it's quite interesting that Pompey had gained power under Sulla and then helped get someone who's anti-Sulla elected. So when we talked about being political factions and just kind of changing with the wind, Pompey is one of these examples. Why he's doing this will come clear throughout his career, but he definitely chases popularity. I always sort of think of Pompey as being a little bit of a needy guy, that he needed kind of almost constant adulation and constant support of the people in order to feel secure in himself. I mean, don't write that in an essay, but it does seem to be a bit of a pattern of his behaviour. So that might be why he gets Lepidus elected, because Lepidus is anti-Sulla. Obviously, we have, I don't know, I didn't highlight it. So Pompey manages to get a large crowd supporting him. I'll go for that colour if it's close enough. So that's fine. Sulla's really unhappy about this and leaves him out of the will, which is basically what this end bit is talking about. We don't need to worry about the rest of it at this point. Now, there are going to be a series of rebellions that occur after Sulla dies. Lepidus is going to be one of them. But it does not mention particularly in the sources, and there's going to be a few others. So it's in this course of these campaigns, they say that first began that jealous rivalry for distinction which he felt towards Pompey. So Crassus is a senator. He has actually climbed the cursus honorum. He hasn't been consul yet, but he has climbed the cursus honorum. And he and Pompey do not get on. And he is definitely jealous of Pompey's military career, which is going to be an issue again throughout the late Republic. Now, with this, of course, of these campaigns, he's referring to some of the ones under Sulla in terms of the Civil War, but also ones that come afterwards. So, like I said, there's there's three main rebellions. Sorry, I lost my train of thought then. There's the Lepidus one. There's one by a guy called Sertorius, which is mentioned down here. And there is also one by Spartacus that most people have heard of. And Pompey acts in all of those. The Spartacus one is one that actually Crassus is involved in quite heavily and did the main work to solve the problem, and then Pompey gets the glory at the end, which we'll talk about that in lesson. So anyway, Pompey and Crassus don't get on. So Pompey stood out as conspicuously great, so much so as Sulla treated him with respect that he seldom showed to older men or to his own equals in rank. Well, that kind of contradicts with what we've just read up here. But that's Plutarch for you. To be honest, he does tend to contradict himself. And he calls him the title of Imperator, which just means general. It does not mean emperor. It just means commander/general. And because Sulla does seem to sort of promote Pompey, which he does to a point we looked at in the previous Plutarch source, this has a mortifying effect on Crassus and makes him jealous. Okay, fine. Now, the reason why, according to Plutarch, that Crassus is not favoured by Sulla is because Crassus was really, really greedy. Now, this is most likely true. Crassus was extraordinarily wealthy and made a lot of money under Sulla, and he's probably one of the richest men that's ever existed, let alone in the Roman Republic, let alone in the world. And he meets sort of a slightly timely and appropriate death towards the end of the period. Sorry, my phone just beeped at me. However, it gives you some examples of how he gets his money. So during the period of the proscriptions and the selling up of confiscated property, he again made himself a bad name by demanding gifts and buying up large estates for low prices. So what he would then do with these estates is he would build really cheap property, tenement buildings for lots of renters, really poor quality, and he would rent them out at a really high price. So he made himself extraordinarily rich as a result of Sulla's proscriptions, which made him quite unpopular, as you can probably imagine. He actually added a man's name to the proscription list in order to get hold of his property. Wasn't just Crassus doing that, but he does seem to be one example. So on the one side, he has all this money, and that makes him quite powerful. He also, according to Plutarch, was remarkably clever at flattering all types of people and getting them on side. So he was really good at kind of creating a client base, and he was a patron for many senators because he was so wealthy. Caesar is going to be one of those people who he patroned, but we'll talk about that when we look at Caesar later. So then we have a few kind of key problems that go on in the Republic. So there is this Sertorius one. So Pompey had been sent out to fight against Lepidus, and he was struggling for money because he'd used most of his money, he talks about here. So he asked the Senate for money and threatened to come back with his army to Italy if his request was not granted. So we do have this beginning of use of the threat of force. This is quite unusual for Pompey to do this, but he's not beyond sort of thing he will do, and he will use force in different ways later in the period. So when we talk about kind of methods, and it's going to be one of our key themes, is the methods in which politicians gain success in this period. The threat of force or the use of violence is one of them, so that's a really good example for that. Now, he sort of talks about some sort of different consuls, and one of them is called Lucilius, and he really wants a command against Mithridates, who's going to cause problems in the 60s, and he was really afraid of giving Pompey an excuse for returning home, since Pompey would have liked to have left Sertorius alone and gone out to Mithridates himself. That is certainly true. It would be a command which bring him much honour. So again, is this kind of example of politicians in this period grasping for opportunities to get dignitas. Have you heard that ting? I'm sorry, that was my cup. However, around this time, Sertorius, who was leading a rebellion in Spain, is murdered by his own party, which is unfortunate. And this guy called Perpenna takes over, but he's a bit useless, to be completely honest. So Pompey fights against him, lures him into a trap, and Perpenna is then captured. Fine. Pompey wins the victory, as it says here, blah, 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 blah. Perpenna brought to Pompey alive, and Pompey ordered him to get killed. Kind of makes sense. Now, at this point, Perpenna offers to produce letters to some important people in Rome who wanted to start a revolution, which is interesting, and change the existing form of government. And we're not giving any more detail on what supposedly this change the existing form of government is. What we do know is that Pompey completely ignores Perpenna and has him killed and doesn't read the letters for whatever reason, probably thought it was just a trick. So essentially Sertorius is then dealt with. Now, as a result of all of this, Pompey obviously has a lot of power, so the people, particularly in the Senate, start to get quite worried about this. So we've got some evidence in this section of Plutarch. So they were also present feeling suspicion of fear. It was thought that instead of disbanding his army, he might go straight ahead and by the use of military force and absolutism make himself into another Sulla. That's quite a long quote. So again, this idea of the use of violence as a method to seize power, and it was obviously people were worried that Pompey was going to do exactly what Sulla had done. And you can kind of understand why they would be worried. Sulla had obviously was still around at this particular point. Well, actually, no, he wasn't. I'm lying. He's dead by now. But there were certainly concerns that Sulla had set a bit of a precedent and people would do the same thing. However, Pompey is not one for seizing power illegally. Well, no, that's not true. Seizing power is the key word. He's not one for taking power by force. That's probably a better way of phrasing it. So actually, he disbands his army as soon as his triumph is over because he's awarded another triumph after Sertorius and Lepidus. And the other thing that people were also worried about is the fact that he was paying more attention to the people than to the Senate. So he does appear to have chosen the people as a route to power. Interesting. And he decided to restore to the tribunes the powers which Sulla had taken away from them. Now this is particularly interesting as Pompey is generally an optimate in terms of his political factions. But the restoration of tribunicum power is very much a populares kind of attitude because it's helping the people. Not to say that optimates didn't want to help people, but you know what I mean. They're not really known for being big reformers in favour of the people. And he seems to do this, according to Plutarch, as it was the one thing above all others which the Roman people most fanatically desired and most eagerly longed for. So was he doing this in order to make himself really, really popular? Yes, possibly. Or he maybe genuinely believed that the tribunes needed to have their powers back, because obviously a lot of their powers had been stripped by Sulla. So we've got lots of evidence in this section of Plutarch about sort of the rise of Pompey. We've got some problems in the Republic in terms of rebellions. We've also got this beginning use of the threat of force, and certainly people were worried that Pompey would be using force to get his own way. So we're going to move on then to this Sallust section. So this is the author, Sallust. He is an interesting author. He's a bit doom and gloomy, to be completely honest. But in this section of the source, he is quoting from a speech. So he's quoting a guy called Macer, who was a tribune in 73 BC. So this is after Sulla's death, but it's before the tribunes have their powers restored. And in this section of the source, basically Macer is going through why he believes that they need to have the tribunican powers restored properly. And he is going to be very critical of basically the republican system of senators and of Sulla. So he talks, for example, about this present servitude contrived by Sulla. So he's basically suggesting that because the tribunes don't have enough powers to protect the plebs, they are being forced to become slaves. Probably not far off, to be honest, but obviously this is rhetoric, so he's going to be exaggerating in order to get his point across. He's quite attacking towards the plebs he's speaking to. He's very critical of them through the source, and that's because he's trying to kind of force them to realise the situation they're in and trying to kind of inspire them into some actual action, into doing something about the situation. So he does kind of he does attack them through varying points. So he calls the tribuneship powerless with an empty semblance of a magistracy as a result of Sulla's reforms. This is a really good quote about Sulla's reforms. And dislodging the highly resourceful nobility from its mastery. So he's also said, when the Senate was the Senate, obviously the Senate was the Senate. So when the tribunes had their full powers, it basically ensured that the nobles couldn't control the plebs, and because they don't have this power properly now, this is why now they are sort of basically being forced to be slaves as a result of it. So he continues with this theme about servitude. So it says, already yield to the mastery of a few. So it's talking about the Senate. You present yourselves as a crowd to individuals to be possessed and enjoyed. So this also gives us some evidence, the idea that there were some politicians in the late Republic who were using the plebs in order to get power. So that's quite a useful quote for that particular theme. But again, it's this kind of idea that the Senate has control, the plebs have no control, you're all being slaves, etc., etc. The source, the speech continues the same theme. So Sulla, who imposed on you a criminal slavery, again pointing it out. This point here is talking about when the tribune lost powers previously, because it had lost, the powers had come and gone, and previously they've been restored and then brought back, and then obviously they've been removed again under Sulla. So that's just what this section up here is talking about. You don't need to particularly worry about it at the moment. And this speech does mention a load of people that you don't need to worry about in the slightest. This Brutus, for example, is not the Brutus who becomes really famous under Caesar. It's a different one, but it is a member of his family, which is why it gets a bit confusing. Same with Curio, he's named someone else later. Anyway, so we do have the idea that there's lots of groups who are trying to gain control of the plebs. And he's sort of saying, this is the situation you're in, and you're sort of calling slavery tranquility. So yes, we have peace in the Republic, everything seems all right, but actually it just means you're being slaves and you're mistaking peace for freedom, which is an interesting political argument, I guess, is still used today. And then we have a section here, you can see there's a lot more relevant information for us. So he is aiming for the tribunican power to restore because it means you're free from the patricians' influence and that all power lies with you, the plebs. Okay, fair enough. It's, are you waiting for the gods to tell you what to do? And in fact, by just kind of allowing the situation to be, so the great commands, constant decrees of the fathers always means the Senate. You are ratifying them, and of your own accord, you are hurrying to abet and aid their license in regard to you. So by doing nothing, by just kind of allowing and passing the laws in the People's Assembly, you're allowing this kind of horrible situation to continue. And it's basically sort of saying it's your fault. Yes, Sulla removed the powers, but the plebs have done nothing about it since, haven't been campaigning for any changes, and this is the situation that you have now found yourself in. And he's also saying that part of the reason why they're allowing us to continue is because they've been given some grain law. So there's been a new, obviously under Sulla, the grain law had been suspended. So the grain dole was no longer being given out to the poorest plebs. And some of the grain law was then restored after Sulla resigned from being dictator. And they're given 5 measures. I think it's a week from memory. I might be slightly wrong on that. And he's also saying, yeah, okay, so the compensation for the fact that you're just allowing the Senate and the patricians to control you is the fact you get this measure of grain. But he says, of course, there's no worth no more than the sustenance in a prison. So you're not getting any more than prisoners would normally get when they're locked up. So he's making that analogy that they're basically under the control, that they're slaves. They're not being treated any better than prisoners. And yes, the grain dole's keeping you happy, but it shouldn't be keeping you happy because it's pretty difficult. It was presented as a reward for your servitude. So that's that point again. What kind of paralysis is constituted by being deceived and be owing a spontaneous debt of gratitude for the unjust treatment of your own property? So that could be referring to the prescriptions when loads of people lost their land and their housing. And then it sort of talks about the fact that we have then CN Pompeius. So this is Pompey the Great. This is this proper Latin version of his name, which is Cneius Pompeius. Sometimes in English it's written with a G instead of a C, just to confuse you. It's because Latin has less letters than English does. So he's suggesting that they have promoted Pompey because they are worried about him, which ties in with what the Plutarch source says previous to this one. To me, at least, it's sufficiently proved that Pompeius, a young man, such glory, prefers to be chief of your blessing rather than an ally in mastery. The above all will be the initiator of the tribunicum power. So this is obviously this is 3 years before Pompey gets elected to be consul. But it does show that, and we said in the Plutarch source, that he had kind of given his support to the restoration of the tribunicum power, and therefore undoing Sulla's reforms. So obviously, this particular tribune is quite happy and basically saying, "Yeah, we've got this young guy, Pompey. He wants your support. And he wants to bring out the tribune power. So that we should obviously support him as a result of it." And then he finishes his speech with another kind of dig at the inaction of the plebs. So the plebs, whatever happens, are like the conquered and will be more so every day, unless you do something about it. So like I said, it's a speech that obviously attacks the Senate, but it's primarily targeted at attacking the plebs and their inaction in their own situation. I'm not sure if he's calling for like insurrection or anything, but he certainly wants them to do something to actually get up and take some action. So then in 70 BC, I'll type that in. Yeah, in 70 BC, Pompey and Crassus are both elected to be consul. Keeping in mind, as I said previously, Pompey has had no political position. The only thing he has done is have an army illegally and conquered places where he shouldn't have done. And now he is elected to be consul. So this is massively undermining the cursus honorum. So, and he was asked to stand for the consulship by his supporters and members of the Senate. And Crassus, who had hoped to become consul at the same time, did not hesitate to ask Pompey for his help. So again, we have the idea that you could borrow some people's dignitas in order to get elected. Pompey has this great military background, and that's why he's very powerful and very popular. And that's why Crassus wants to throw in his lot with him. Pompey's happy to do so because he wants Crassus in one way or other under an obligation to him for some favour. So we're talking about patrons and clients in that particular section. And he basically says to the assembly of the people that if they give him Crassus as colleague, he'd be grateful for that consulship as well. So he wants Crassus to be elected. So initially things seem to be quite good. However, they are from slightly different political backgrounds. So Pompey, as I said, generally is an optimate. Crassus is a populares by nature, although obviously at this point Pompey, because he's aiming to restore the tribunicum powers, is showing more populares traits than probably optimate traits at this particular point. So initially they were quite friendly, however they can't maintain it. They differed on practically on every point, constantly quarrelling, always trying to get better with each other. So they made themselves as consul politically ineffective and achieved nothing. That's not entirely true. They did restore the tribunicum power. Well done to them. Quite a big thing that Plutarch is kind of skipping over. But obviously when we talked about the Roman constitution and one of the possible problems is having two consuls that don't agree with each other, and obviously legislation then finds it quite hard to get past. This is an example of that. Beyond the Tyrannican power and the fact that Crassus holds a big feast and gives out a load of grain, nothing else is particularly achieved. So we have problems with the constitution there. And obviously Pompey has undermined it just by being elected, to be honest. So the final source, I'm just double checking I'm right. He's probably scrolling thinking, oh my god, it's long. Yeah, it is, but it's not too bad. Is a speech by Cicero. In lesson, I mentioned that Cicero made himself very famous through a particular court case against someone called Verus. Well, this is a section of the speech he gave at the court case. So this is the one about, so Verus was a governor, I think it's of Sicily from memory, and he had been hugely had been very corrupt even during his time as provincial governor, probably no more than others were, to be honest, but he is being prosecuted as a result of it. I should point out, in terms of court cases, I didn't mention this beforehand, that court cases in Rome are always brought by an individual, it's not by the state. So in this case, Cicero was kind of hired, press-ganged by some provincial people from Sicily, and he is the one bringing the case against Verus. Now, in this speech, he is talking to a jury that is made up of members of the Senate, because that's one of the reforms that have been put in place by Sulla, was that the juries were now made up of senators. Now, in order to help prove his case, he is going to attack the Senate and the jury system in particular. He's going to give us some different examples of trials that had been corrupted in the past, and sort of say, and basically his point is, look, Senate, all these cases have been known to be bribed, all the rest of it, all while the Senate's been control of the courts. So if you find this guy not guilty again, we will know that you have been bribed again, despite the evidence I'm giving you. So he's kind of trying to shame the Senate, senatorial jury, into obviously finding this guy guilty, and the end result is that Verus himself goes into exile and he is then found guilty anyway. So just be aware that this is quite a hostile speech that he gives, and I'm not going to go through it bit by bit because it takes too long, but essentially that it talks about, it says, a domination sovereignty of yours over the courts just delights you so much. The Senate's really happy because they've got power, and since there are some men who are neither ashamed of a licentiousness, I can't say that word, sorry, and their infamy. So he's sort of saying, there are people on the jury who are corrupt and bribed and don't care, and this is obviously leading to people looking at the jury system with disdain, understandably. And he makes this point further. So the whole order of the Senate is weighed down by the discredit brought on it by the wickedness and audacity of a few. So, and he talks about the infamy of the tribunal. So there are obviously really famous trials that have occurred. People have been found not guilty due to bribery. Everyone knows what's going on. And you should obviously be ashamed of yourself, Senate. This is terrible. Makes the point a bit further on, to receive money or to promise money or to act as agents in bribery. So everybody knows these trials are now corrupt, and isn't it awful? And he makes the point again. Ever since the office of the judge has been transferred to the Senate, has been nefariously and wickedly done in the decision of judicial matters, i.e. they've been finding guilty people not guilty, and isn't it terrible? A lot of these speeches do tend to repeat themselves because they're using rhetoric to make a particular point, and they're going to emphasise a particular argument all the way through. Again, he's making the same basic point. The judicial authority was transferred to the senatorial body, and the power of the Roman people over everyone else was taken away, so the people lost power. That a man of praetorian rank could not honestly be condemned at less price than 300,000 sesterces. So again, it's like, it's obvious. Everyone knows that if you go in front of a senatorial jury, which all juries now are, the rich are going to be found not guilty because they can bribe. And then he gives some different examples that you don't need to worry about, but he mentions a few cases that this has occurred in. So why is it in the case of Marcus Attilius is another example? He was convicted of treason. This was made plain that they had all received money for the purpose of influencing the judicial decision. So even if someone's found guilty, that we all know it's done because of bribery. So the whole system he's claiming is completely corrupted. That disgrace, that calamity of the whole senatorial order, that this thing has actually happened in the city while the senatorial order furnished the judges. So again, as you can say, it's kind of making a point. He also says here that basically, as a result of it, in this whole section here, that the provincial people are not bothered is not the right way, but kind of resigned to the fact that they can't bring their governors to trial because nothing's going to happen, because they're going to be found not guilty. So what's the point? So it kind of says, when the allies of the Roman people are unwilling for trials of extortion to take place, because they don't see the point anymore. So they're not bothering to do it, other than obviously this particular case. So it's kind of, look at where your greed has taken, look where your corruption has brought, where all these people who are clearly guilty are not being prosecuted because nobody sees the point in doing it. So the purpose, so he says what this case is going to do is for the purpose of delivering your whole order from hatred, from unpopularity, from infamy, and from disgrace. So you can see that the people don't like the Senate, and he's saying, look, I'm giving you the opportunity to stop this now and to improve your standing with the ordinary people. Nor, in fact, is there any other reason for which Pompey was so much earnestly sought the restoration of Tribunican power. So he's linking this in with this as well. Now, the Verus case is, from memory, it's in 70 BC. I don't know why I scrolled up to have a look because it doesn't tell you the date. It's in 70 BC. So it is around the time when the tribune's power was being restored. And so, people are getting their power back. Isn't it great? And you mentioned Cneius Pompeius, so Pompey the Great, a most gallant and illustrious man who made motion about the tribunican power. I will point out that Cicero really wants to be friends with Pompey and really wants to have him as an ally. That's why he's being so kind of positive about Pompey, even though the fact that Pompey's obviously broken the law to become consul. But hey, whatever, we ignore that particular point. So it goes further to say why he's amazing. He would restore the power of the tribunes. A great shout was raised its words, and a grateful murmur pervaded the assembly. Shows that people were supporting Pompey and wanted tribunican power back. So a very popular motion. And when he had said also in the same assembly that the provinces were depopulated and tyrannized over, that the courts of justice were becoming, I think it's supposed to say, base and wicked, and he desired to provide for and to remedy that evil. So not only was he campaigning for the restoration of the tribunican power, he was also suggesting that the jurors needed to be changed in some form or another to make them less corrupt. So even Pompey the Great is aware of how corrupt the whole system is. And it says that people supported that with a universal uproar. So people were really happy about Pompey suggesting the courts and the justice system needed to be changed. Can you please know, nearly at the end of this particular speech. So he sort of says, now men are on the watchtowers, which sounds really ominous. Basically saying people are now observing this trial and they are watching you and how they are going to see the outcome of this particular case. And if you basically don't find this guy guilty, they're going to judge you and they're going to see the real problems that the court system has. It will be determined whether, when senators are the judges, a very guilty and a very rich man can be condemned. So he's kind of using it as a saying, this is a litmus test for you guys, the Senate, or senator or juror, sorry. If you don't find this guy guilty, and I'm going to put the evidence that this guy is painfully guilty, which he was, and you don't find him guilty, everybody's going to everybody knows you're all corrupted anyway, but it's going to be exposed. And we've got evidence that the people wanted changes to the courts. So if you don't listen to the people, it's going to really come back against you and bite you. And therefore, you have to make sure you find this guy guilty. So it's quite an unusual source in many ways, because Cicero was an optimate. He believed in the power of the Senate. What he doesn't like, however, is obviously guilty people being found not guilty. He doesn't like corruption. And he really highlights one of the major political problems in the late Republic is this level of corruption that pervaded everything. So the Senate and the courts and all of society.